Thank you. Okay, yeah, so as Courtney said, my name is Mark Imbriaco, and I work at GitHub. And so the first thing we should probably start with is figure out exactly what problem we're trying to solve. I'm going to hold off on defining what ChatOps is, and hopefully we can kind of work together throughout this to figure out what that means. So Fred, this morning during his keynote, talked about how the people systems are just as important as the technical systems. And I couldn't agree with him more, but I think he even undersold it a little bit. I think the people systems are far more important than the technical systems. And in fact, I think that if you look over a long enough time scale, then the technical systems begin to look like the people systems and the organization around them that build them. And I think that, so at GitHub, we're trying to use ChatOps as a tool to improve the way that our people systems work, and hopefully by extension improve the way that our technical systems work. So ChatOps is all about helping us work better together. At GitHub, we have 215 hubbers, that's what we call ourselves, spread across 103 cities, at least as of Saturday when I pulled this map from one of our internal tools. And this is not abnormal. This is a pretty normal distribution. Normally at GitHub, we have about 60% of the company that is not in San Francisco, where we're headquartered at any given time. Sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. Once a year, we all get together, and all the dots on the map move to San Francisco for a week, and then they spread back out again. But generally, this is kind of what we deal with. And communication in any organization of 200 people is a pretty difficult problem. When you're in 103 cities, you can imagine how much worse it is, right? So we have to be very deliberate and thoughtful about how we communicate. And we try to use chat as a way to bridge that. So ChatOps, on the ops team, we have, again, we've got this distribution. The ops team is a kind of extreme case. On the ops team, we have exactly one person in San Francisco. And the rest of us are spread all over the place. I live in Wake Forest, North Carolina. We've got people in Savannah, Georgia, and Nashville, and Seattle, and England, and Sydney, Australia, and kind of all over the place. You get the idea. So we have tools like GitHub and email and other sorts of web systems and internal apps we've built that help us communicate asynchronously. But humans are incredibly social animals, even introverted ones like many of us, at least me. And we like to have the option for real-time or semi-real-time communication. And I say semi-real-time because it's important when we talk about chat to understand that kind of the social contract at GitHub around chat doesn't require you to be immediately responsive to everything you see. Chat is still asynchronous, but it's more synchronous than GitHub or email or other sorts of notification mechanisms. And over the years, the way that we use chat has had a pretty dramatic effect on the way that GitHub as a whole works. And we're going to look at some of those ways. And it's not just the ops team. So we use chat to run GitHub. ChatOps is not tech ops. It's GitHub ops. It's business ops. It's the entire company. The way that we work is heavily influenced by chat. So before I get too much further, Courtney talked about Hubot. Hubot is our friendly little robot that makes all the magic work. He's a Node.js application that runs anywhere that Node can run. Lots and lots and lots of people run it on Heroku. There was a couple of years ago, someone created an app that builds a Heroku app. They built an app to build a Heroku app to run Hubot for you. And I worked at Heroku at the time, and we saw our use of Node.js go up by like 600% that day. So Hubot is a Node.js app that doesn't do very much out of the box. He can respond to a few simple commands. And what he does is he sits in a chat room, or he listens on a command shell if you're debugging or doing development, and he can connect to things like Campfire or IRC or Google Talk or Skype, or you get the idea. There's, I think, a dozen plus connectors that he has. And he listens for events that either come from chat or come externally, and he's kind of the GPIO if you were in the New Relic talk for chat. Right? He can take input from chat and output it somewhere else, or he can take input from somewhere else and put it in the chat. And out of the box, like I said, he doesn't do very much. He can display images of pugs, or he can do some very, very basic things. He can do some simple math. Not very much. But the magic happens when you build additional functionality into him to automate, well, everything. And you can find out more. This is a screenshot of the Hubot website. You can go to hubot.github.com if you're interested. And that's probably all the technology we're going to talk about. So we use Hubot and ChatOps for socialization at GitHub. I mentioned that we're very, very distributed. And so since we're so distributed and since we don't have the kind of face-to-face or water cooler contact that you would have, we're not walking down the hall and bumping into each other. We're not going out for drinks after work. It's very easy to sort of lose track of everyone else and not have context to the lives of your coworkers and friends, right? A lot of us at GitHub consider each other friends. So we use ChatOps in a lot of different ways. For example, some of these are going to be screenshots. This is a screenshot from our chat. We have a command called remote me, which Hubot says 131 of you meatbags are not in San Francisco right now. And you get avatars of everyone. Or we have an Instagram connector that is hooked up to Hubot. So whenever people in GitHub who have decided that they would like to be part of the Instagram group post an image, it gets dropped into one of our main chat rooms. So we can kind of have some context. This is actually one of my favorites. This is a very simple little hack, but it allows us to have kind of some context into the outside of work life of people that we spend a lot of time with every day. And this is really useful for when you have those times when you actually do have face-to-face communication. So once a year, we all get together. And someone who joined GitHub 6 months ago, I may not have ever met in person. But when I see them at our annual summits, and I walk up to them, and we have this shared context of each other's lives. You lose that awkward meeting. You lose that sense of not knowing someone, right? That you have to be introduced, right? It's like, hey, I'm Mark. How was that steak you had last week? Or how was that game you went to? That was a great game, right? You sent those pictures from the baseball game, or whatever. So this is a great hack. And then pugs. Who doesn't love pugs? I mean, come on. And this is a fun one. We have this command called conify. What conify does is it takes the Star Trek con, and it takes a word that you give to it, and it spreads it out as a caption on con. So this one was going to say, no ops, but Hubot actually broke. And this is what happens when you don't have ops. So I thought this was appropriate. You don't have no ops, Hubot doesn't even work. And emoji. Maybe I just want to express my admiration for someone else in the company. And what better way to do that than with an emoji that's made of other emoji? Right? This is just, we have dozens and dozens of these kinds of very small commands that individually seem silly or they don't seem particularly useful. But when you put them all together, they sort of build an experience that is sort of uniquely GitHub, and it really informs the culture and the way that we communicate with one another and the way that we interact. But ChatOps isn't just for fun. It's also for collaborating and getting work done. And it's not just for the ops team. It's for development teams. It's for business operations. It's for our press team. It's for everyone in the company. So some of the ways that we use ChatOps to collaborate, we have it hooked up to, this is actually interesting. This is, I mentioned that we have this social contract that you don't have to be in every room. We have dozens and dozens of rooms, so it would be very difficult to. But what we do have is that if you mention someone by name in a room that they're not currently in, Hubot will send a push notification to your phone to tell you that you got mentioned. And again, the social contract is if you're free and you're not busy, you can jump in and see if they need help. This is kind of I like to think of this as the equivalent of, if you're in a cube farm, someone standing up and just kind of looking around to see if Bob's around. This is kind of the ChatOps version of that. So this is foreshadowing. We'll come back to this. So this is, you mention their name and they get notified. This is more foreshadowing. You can also register phrases you want to know about. So in this case, I said, anytime somebody uses the word DDoS in chat, I want to get a push notification. And we'll see more about that in a minute. And another way we use chat is we have it hooked up to GitHub itself. So whenever anyone creates an issue or a pull request in GitHub, we drop a link into the chat room that gives you the subject line and gives you a link back to the issue. And this is, you may think, but GitHub already does that. It sends me an email. I get other notifications. But the reason why this is useful is it lets us kind of, again, in semi-real time, see what other people are working on. And if someone created an issue about a particular topic, and there's a link here, I can jump in there, I can comment on the issue, and I can have a pretty good chance that the person who created the issue is still thinking about it, and they haven't context switched away. So I can have kind of a quick interaction about that topic, or I can come back later if I want to. And another way that we use this is maybe a couple of hours later, I see this issue in my other notification stream because I wasn't paying attention to Campfire at the time. And I drop a link to the issue in. This link got shortened. I dropped the entire URL from my URL bar in GitHub in there, and it turns it into a link like that. But this is a link back directly to the issue in GitHub, so we can have a conversation about that issue directly in chat. Now, when you first see this slide, you probably are a little concerned, right? Because you're like, now we're going to have a conversation in the issue, and we're going to have a conversation in chat, and how am I going to keep track of what's happening here? Well, this is where Hubot comes in. So whenever I drop in a link like that into chat, Hubot sees it, and Hubot goes into the issue that was referenced and says, hey, somebody was talking about this in chat, and gives me a link to the exact line in the chat transcript where that conversation happened. So now you can have a free-flowing conversation that goes from GitHub to chat, back and forth, and we have issues where this happens back and forth, several times. And you don't have to be concerned that the mechanism you're using isn't appropriate, or that not everyone's around, or you want to have a semi-real-time conversation, but you want to include that guy in Australia who's sleeping right now. He's going to be able to catch up later, so you don't have to worry about those things nearly as much. So ChatOps is really about, in this case, about enabling those kinds of conversations without having to think too much about the rules. And then when I close the issue, I get another note in the chat room just to sort of circle back and close the issue. Another way we use it is commits. This was a commit to a repository called shell. This is where we keep a lot of shell scripts, actually. And many of the ChatOps commands that I ran are powered by these. So this is a link to the exact commit that was pushed. And what's interesting here is that at GitHub, the way that we work is whenever anything gets merged into the master branch, like it did here, we run continuous integration against it, and if it passes, we just deploy it. So we ship it. What happened here is he made this push, and then we got a notice, hey, Hubot says, look, we just built this thing, and it passed. Now I'm going to deploy it. Hey, look, and the deployment's done. And you can click on any of these links to get context about what exactly happened at each point along the way. So if you wanted to see the build, you can see all the build output. If you want to see the deploy, and so on. So this is really useful for allowing people to collaborate around deployment and understanding what each other are working on, right? One of the problems, and this is a huge problem in ops teams, I think especially. I think ops teams in general have a tendency to lone wolf, right? Where you've got this one guy who's interneting in his terminal, and he's doing things, and no one knows about it until they see, I don't know, something at 3 a.m. that they didn't expect. And this allows us to collaborate on things like that. Everything happens in a repo. All the commits happen. You see the deploys in real time. If this deploy happens, if this was github.com, the deploy happens and 5 minutes later the site goes down. I have a pretty good idea what happened. And these are interesting. Some deploys are scoped to specific rooms. So we have a room that's dedicated to github.com development. And you can only deploy from there. And things like that. You can also deploy if you want to deploy a specific branch, or you want to run a deploy to restart things, something like that, you can deploy explicitly. This deploy command actually has a lot of parameters that you can pass as well. So you can say deploy this to staging, or deploy this particular branch to staging, or we've got several different staging environments. So you can kind of choose what your target is. So deploy is one of the things that happens dozens and dozens of times a day. And these are just some examples of how we collaborate. Again, we have, I think I looked and I saw 300 CoffeeScript plugins, and we have another, I don't even know, 100 shell scripts that do random things. And we'll go through a few more of those in a little bit. But we use Hubot to collaborate. Now, a lot of us here are either ops folks or ops interested in ops. So the next section is about how we do how we use chat to actually operate the website and our infrastructure. And these are, I'm just going to run through some of these to see how much I can terrify the audience. So the first one's pretty straightforward. This one shouldn't scare anyone. These are the first three of these that say /pager all talk to Pingdom, or not Pingdom, excuse me, PagerDuty. We use Pingdom as well. And the last three talk to Nagios. So the typical flow here is you get woken up at 3 a.m., you look and you see the PagerDuty icon on your phone, you throw your phone across the room, pull your laptop out, and go into the room and say, pager incidents, tell me what that was because my screen is now broken and I can't see it. And then maybe you decide you want to acknowledge it or you want to resolve it. So those commands do pretty much what you would expect them to. The Nagios commands are similar. Nagios ACK, you can ACK a particular alert. You can check, the status one is interesting. The status will give you the output of the command that failed. So it'll say, okay, postfix queue was 3 million messages deep, whatever happened to wake you up. And the check one is also interesting. The check one can tell Nagios to run a check right now because I think I fixed it and I want to go back to sleep and I don't want to wait for you to get around to it. So these are all pretty straightforward. These aren't particularly surprising or interesting, really. In fact, the plugins for these are open source, and I don't know where they are, but you can Google it. Or you can use GitHub Code Search. These are interesting as well. This is how we update our external status site. So if we have an incident, whoever is working the incident updates the status site directly from chat, so everyone can see what's happening. And we often collaborate around these. So we'll say, hey, here's a proposed status message, and they'll type /status and what they plan to write. And someone says, yep, that's cool, ship it, and they'll just copy and paste it. What's cool about this, when you go into yellow or red, actually, let me back up. Let me talk a little bit about how we do it on call at GitHub. We have a couple of tiers on the ops team. We have the sort of immediate response to sort of routine issues. I don't like to use the word routine because we shouldn't have routine issues, but sort of the tier 1 response to troubleshooting. And then we have an incident commander rotation, which consists of people who are dedicated to running response for large-scale incidents. The entire site is down. We're getting a big DDoS, whatever. Whenever the status changes from green to yellow or red, that automatically pages the incident commander as well. So the person who's responding to the incident gets woken up at 3 a.m., like, oh, the site's down, let me go to status red. They don't have to worry about paging anyone. They don't have to worry about communication there. They just go to status red immediately. The incident commander gets paged, and they can continue to investigate the issue. And we'll talk about this again in a little bit. But this, again, is pretty straightforward. This shouldn't be particularly scary. Anybody in the room a network engineer? Sweet. You should all be horrified by what you see on the screen right now. Yes, we can adjust BGP routes from our chat room. The first example there is on router 2, please disable my cogent transit, and you can all figure out why. And the second one is a basic status thing, but we can do lots of things on our border routers from chat. We can adjust peering relationships. We can take peers down. We can bring peers back up again. We can route traffic differently. That's a little bit scary to some network engineers. If it's not scary and you're a network engineer, come talk to me after because we're hiring. But some of these are terrifying to people that aren't really used to the ChatOps flow. And it took me a little while to get used to some of these as well. We have some that do things like rebalance shards across our file server tier, and that's horrifying to me because the consequences of failure are so bad. But the reality is, I'm either going to run it from a chat room or I'm going to run a shell script from a terminal. If I ran it here, at least everyone saw it. So at the end of the day, this is repeatable. It's tested. It's commonly used. It's actually not tested in the TDD kind of sense. It's tested in that we use it all the time. And if it stopped working, we would notice.
Are there permissions built in?
No. Yeah, no.
Says the brave man.
Right. Well, we have chat transcripts, right? We have chat transcripts. We can see who did it. We can ask them why they did it. No one's going to do things like this if they don't understand it. I mean, we treat people like adults, again. Exactly right. And we do have permissions for specific chat rooms at times, but generally that's like, don't let the contractors in. The last two are pretty straightforward. They take a specific switch in our infrastructure and they ask it questions like, who are your LLDP neighbors, or what's the status on all the interface ports, and so on. Pretty basic. Those are less scary. If you want to see some really horrifying ones, come see me again afterwards and I'll show you some really terrifying ones. We have a tool called gpanel. Gpanel, anybody who went to the Dropbox talk earlier where they have this inventory and provisioning system, that's what gpanel is for us. So gpanel keeps track of all of our physical and cloud hosts. It keeps track of all of our physical server inventory in the data center that's ready to be provisioned or is already provisioned. It lets us do things like take a piece of bare metal and put an OS on it, Pixie install it, run a particular Puppet environment on the first boot, those kinds of things. It lets us turn on the blinking lights so that we at least have an outside chance of the remote hands changing the hard drive in the right box. It lets us list the running hosts and so on. It's pretty straightforward. Again, this is all pretty natural. We started out with a web interface on gpanel. We still have it, but we've actually been talking about getting rid of it because no one actually uses it. And to the cloud. So this was actually my fault. I wrote this AWS script. We went from 0 to way too much spend on Amazon in about 2 weeks when I turned up the ability for us to provision EC2 hosts from chat. And one thing that was really interesting here that we sort of iterated on, this gets back to Corey's question a little bit about permissions. We still don't have permissions. Anybody can spin this up. But we've talked about things lately like when you provision a new host, telling you how much it's going to cost. And one thing we added fairly recently is when you provision a new host, we add metadata to the instance that tells you who did it. I said, I think the command for it's cloud AWS who, but I have a pull request to change that to blame, like git blame, cloud blame. Whose fault is it that we have this instance? These are all pretty straightforward, though. We make a lot of use of AWS for burstable kind of capacity. We use EC2 and Direct Connect and love it. But yeah, so that's, again, something that's not particularly scary. This one's a little terrifying. Anybody that uses Pacemaker, we use Pacemaker for high availability on our file server tier. So this thing can do things like verify the status of particular Pacemaker resources, or make sure that the cluster configuration looks sane, or reset the fail count. That's a particularly scary one. But the fail count that usually sets is Dell have these wonderful DRAC cards that sometimes actually work. And we use them for Stoneth for shooting the other node in the head when we have a split brain situation, or we have a situation where we need to kill a master and do an election. So what happens is the DRAC cards on the Dell will stop working. Pacemaker will see that and say, oh, I can't Stoneth now. So we'll reset the fail count from chat. But we can adjust any resource from chat in that similar way. So that one's a little scary too. It's actually really terrifying to me because I have no idea how Pacemaker works. And we do a lot of other things. So we have MySQL really heavily integrated into chat now, actually. We can see what our hierarchy of slaves is. We can run MySQL query digests from chat and get a live sample of the current queries running on the system. We can get explain results back from systems. We can promote masters and slaves from chat. We can do tons and tons of maintenance on our MySQL cluster. Our DBA has, and in fact, our DBA wrote all those. So he's done an amazing job there. We have our load balancers hooked up, so we can do things like adjust the weighting on different services on the back ends, or we can adjust load balancers, or we can pull a load balancer out of our tier and test against it and put it back again and adjust our load balancers speak BGP too, and that plays with BGP and does all kinds of interesting things, which is probably terrifying. And we can talk to Fastly and change our CDN configuration on the fly. And we can pull back graphs from Fastly through some ridiculous, crazy mechanized script that scrapes their web UI. There's all kinds of interesting things we can do. We can manage basically every single thing about our Elasticsearch cluster from chat. So we can relocate shards across the cluster. We can check the health. We can respond to failures. There's tons and tons of things we can do there as well. And lots and lots and lots more. I have, again, anybody that's curious about it, I'm happy to share more. I just had to stop somewhere, but we have tons and tons of this stuff. So I wanted to share an anecdote about how we might use ChatOps to kind of tie it all together. And I wanted to go back in our history and find an incident that I thought was particularly interesting that I could give some context on and to tell a story. And a funny thing happened on the way to Velocity. When I was at the airport on Monday morning, GitHub had an issue Monday morning and the way that I know we had an issue is because one of my colleagues, Will, changed the status to yellow. And as I mentioned earlier, the incident commander gets paged when the status changes from green to anything else. And I happen to be the incident commander that day. So his status is we're investigating problems reaching github.com, and that sets my oh crap radar off pretty bad because we've had some serious problems lately with reachability. So I get this lovely PagerDuty alert. And I'm like, okay, I got 20 minutes until I board. This is fine, no problem. I pull my laptop out, tether it to my phone, log in, and I scroll up. I look in chat. I can see what he's investigated. I can see all the graphs he's pulled down. I can see what all the work he's done so far is, so I can get kind of a picture of the incident. And this is amazingly useful. So I didn't have to ask him, hey, what have you looked at? I didn't have to say, what have you eliminated? I could just look and see. So then I pulled down the list of incidents, and I'm like, okay, let my little ops lizard brain go to work on this. Oh yeah, I know how these things sit on the network. Let's look at a graph. So I used this command called GraphMe. GraphMe is actually, I wish I had more slides on this, but I suck at making slides. So GraphMe is our favorite command. We have hundreds of graphs. We don't actually have any dashboards. We have graphs that we pull into chat using this GraphMe command. and you say graph me at something, and the at does an auto, it calls out to the graphing service and auto completes. So you just type the first few characters and like, oh, that's the one I want. So I said, hey, show me the inbound border traffic. And this way over there on the left where it looks like a flat line isn't actually a flat line. The amplitude is just so low that it doesn't show up on the graph compared to everything else. So, and this graph is actually, it shows you the event and it shows you the recovery. So this isn't exactly what I saw. I saw the first kind of part of it where it went up very, very quickly. So now anybody who pays attention to GitHub at all has a really good idea where this story is going. So if you pay attention to GitHub, you might note that we've had some issues with DDoS lately. And on Monday at 6 a.m. when I was at the airport, we had the biggest DDoS we've ever seen at GitHub. I don't want to talk about how big it was, but it was several tens of gigabits. And the response to that, once we figured out what the problem was, the response to that was this. And 2 minutes later, the site was back. I'll let that sink in just for a second because I think that's pretty awesome. I typed /mitigation. That's not exactly what I typed. I typed the name of our service provider, which you can look up on the internet, but I'm not allowed to say. I turned on mitigation. We routed our traffic to a service provider. They ate all the bad traffic, and we went on about our day. Literally, it took something like 2 minutes to recover once I started this. We would have been back up from the initial event within a couple of minutes, but we had some monitoring issues that we need to look into, and we didn't get alerted fast enough. But this is really amazing. And anyone on the team who had seen this alert could have responded exactly like I did. And this is the beauty of it, right? Somebody says, oh, look, there's a DDoS event. I don't have to be that network guy that understands how to work the DDoS device, or I don't have to be that one guy that is comfortable changing routes on our border router because he's scared of what's going to happen. We scripted it, so you don't have to think about it. You type /mitigation enable, and this magic word thing, I'll talk about that for a second. For some particularly scary commands, we have a rotating daily magic word. So I typed mitigation enable, and it said, oh, it looks like you were trying to turn on mitigation. If you really want to do that, today's magic word is smash. So I did it again with the magic word, and away it went. So this was pretty cool. And I couldn't help but tweet. I was like, I don't remember what it was. It was something like, just mitigated a DDoS from ChatOps from the airport 10 minutes before my flight. No big deal. It was pretty fun. So ChatOps on the ops team does a lot of things for us. We're a very distributed team, and actually, let me ask a question. I debated whether I was going to ask this question. Anyone in the room have documentation of their infrastructure? Yeah. Does anyone in the room have up-to-date documentation of their infrastructure? And if anybody raised their... I think you're lying. Let's talk about this later. There was one guy that raised his hand, and it was kind of halfway, so that's why I think he's lying. I don't have up-to-date documentation on my infrastructure. But when a new person joins our team, just by being in chat and seeing how we operate the infrastructure, they can learn an incredible amount. And we have help commands in chat that they can use to see commands. But the reality is that just being part of the chat room, just seeing how the team operates, kind of gives you an over-the-shoulder view of not just perhaps one mentor if you're at a company that does a mentoring kind of onboarding process. It lets you see how everyone works. It lets you get a context of kind of what the ebb and flow of a day looks like at GitHub. It lets you see how we respond to incidents. It lets you lose some of that fear about making changes and operating our infrastructure. So that's hugely important. It also allows you in the heat of the moment in an incident to understand what the context of the incident, what's happened so far. If I'm troubled, one of my favorite things, this is the recovery, by the way. Throughput went down, came back. I'll get back to that in a second. So it lets me get the context of what's happened in the incident so far. And it lets me collaborate with people on my team in a way that I couldn't do before. I mean, I could go to a war room and sit around a conference table and we could all yell at each other. But that's like, hey, come look over my shoulder at this graph. It's not, hey, look at this graph. It's not. I don't even say that. I just pull up the graph and they see it, right? So oftentimes what happens is one of my colleagues will pull up a graph, and that'll trigger. It may not even show the actual problem, but it gets my thought process going down a particular avenue. and I'll pull up a different graph that gets us closer to the problem, and they'll pull up another one that gets them closer to the problem. And all this takes 8 seconds, right? It's super fast. You see the graph. Somebody else says, oh, that's close. Let's try this. And you can very quickly, collaboratively respond to an incident without having to explicitly say what you're doing, without having to explicitly ask somebody to go investigate a particular problem. So ChatOps really helps to give us that shared context. And who doesn't love pugs? Right, so we still have the social aspects. We still drop images in chat. We still have all kinds of memes. We use it for fun. We use it for work. We use it to collaborate. ChatOps is pretty awesome. And that's why you don't just write a shell script, because at the end of the day, they are just shell scripts. And if Qbot's down, we can run them from a server. But why would we want to when we have chat? So ChatOps is a tool that helps teams work better together. And that's all I got, but I should have plenty of time for questions, I think. Sweet. I talked too fast. Corey.
How do you manage just the fire hose of information? Like, how many different rooms are there? How do people get siloed? Do people belong to many rooms at once? How does that whole process work for 215 people?
Yeah, so the question was, how do you manage the fire hose of information when we have dozens and dozens of rooms and 200 employees? How do you decide what you want to care about? And actually, that was foreshadowing. The answer is you decide what you want to care about. People don't get siloed, but they do sort of associate with particular areas of the company. So, for example, the rooms, I'll give you an idea. The rooms that I'm in are our ops room, our security room, our enterprise support room, our support room, our cheddar room, which is actually really cool. Qbot will, every couple of minutes, just drop in how much money we've made over the last day, month, and year, and tell us how much it's going to be at the end of the year if it continues at that rate. So we're very transparent with that kind of stuff. And I like to watch that because it's fun. So it's really up to the individual how they decide to work at GitHub, right? What teams they are aligned with and what their interests align to. There's got to be more questions. Oh, yeah, sorry.
It's kind of related, but you've mentioned
That's cool.
that you've been dealing with a lot of DDoSs lately.
Yep.
Are these like angry CVS users?
If I knew who was DDoSing us, they wouldn't be DDoSing us anymore. I wish I knew, honestly. They are very interesting. Yeah, it's very interesting.
I'd be curious if there's like some correlation with some big like Python community kerfuffle, and that's how they're like dealing with it.
Yeah, I don't think it is related to. He's asking if we know why we're being attacked, and I don't think it's angry developers. I think the likely scenario is that it's related to GitHub pages because we host web pages basically for anybody that wants to put content online, and it could be anything. It could be government. It could be anything. It could be somebody who's angry at the Republicans. Who knows, right? We have no idea. But
I didn't even think of that.
Yeah, I think that's kind of our working theory, but really we don't have any idea. I mean, we have some theories, but we don't have a solution yet. James?
So ChatOps encourages a particular type of interaction, and do you think you're hiring reflects people who can cope with that sort of style? Because a lot of people are like very much more personally interactive, and ChatOps would obviously for some of those people not be something they could cope with, like the flow of information,
Right.
having a face-to-face conversation, no emotional content.
Right. Yeah, so James asked, ChatOps encourages a specific kind of communication, and do we think the hiring process reflects that? Because we need a specific kind of person who doesn't need the face-to-face interaction, and there's a potential lack of emotional content. I think that the answer is yes, our hiring process reflects it to an extent, but not because of ChatOps, because we've chosen to be a distributed company and hire the best people no matter where they live. So I think that if you're going to be a distributed company, you need to figure out ways to communicate that don't involve face-to-face. And ChatOps is just one of them. We use Google Hangouts a ton. We have those little double robotics things in the office that you have an iPad on that roll around the office and annoy people. Those are awesome. So we have toys like that, and we heavily use video broadcasting and streaming in the office. So we do weekly all-hands meetings, and we have literally a 3-man team that's responsible for doing video production and streaming from our office because we do so much content generation. So we try to keep everyone involved in a variety of ways, and ChatOps is just one of them. But the sort of lack of emotional, is that what you used? Emotional context. I think we use the hell out of emoji to try to get past that. Like, we overuse emoji. We use a ton of emoji. And I think it works really well for people that accept that we're trying to find a way to, you almost have to overshare with emoji and try to really push that emotional context in, because you're right, there can be a lack of that. And for people that don't embrace that, it can be troubling. But I think that it's a remote working issue, right? You have to try to find people that are suited to that, and you have to try to coach people to get better at that. Yeah.
Just wanted to ask, all these active scripts that change the environment and do things, are they always invoked by operators, by humans, or do you also sometimes automatically invoke them in response to maybe monitoring events?
Sure. Yeah, the question was, are the scripts that get triggered by Hubot always triggered by an operator, or do they get issued by monitoring, for example? And the answer is it's a mix. We do have some automatic remediation for specific kinds of events that we're comfortable with, and we're trying to do more there. But yeah, it's a mix. So it's a mix.
So in the case of this automatic remediation, is it still going through the chat room, or is it going through a parallel pass and then just report?
That's a good question. It depends, right? Because the automatic remediation stuff is generally triggered by things like Nagios event handlers. So if Nagios gets a critical alert, that's going to go to chat, because you're going to see that there was a critical event, because all those end up in chat. If it's something that catches it when it's in warn and never gets to crit, then there's no point in telling anybody. They get logged. We do lots and lots of logging, and we pay Splunk entirely too much money, but we get all that data there too. Yeah.
Do you tamp down or cut off other interface methods to stop people in the chat?
Yeah, the question was, do we tamp down other interface methods? Do we make it so that you have to use ChatOps? And the answer is no, we don't. It's just sort of the social contract, right? Like, there's some people that use a lot of the ChatOps commands from shells frequently. And I actually do it too. I think I do it for, there's a kind of a category of stuff that you don't necessarily care about sharing. But most things that are going to affect the environment, that are going to mutate the environment, sort of the social contract we have, the way that we work, involves doing it through chat. But we don't enforce that in any way. I think the way we would enforce it would never be to not allow you to do it in chat. It would just be to, put sad pugs on the screen.
Statement and a question.
Okay.
So who here was in Dave's session, Dave's way back session? So this to me really struck me as a really anti-fragile thing. Did anybody else get that? You guys are managing the downsides this way, right?
Right.
So I think the thing that I struggled with in Dave's talk is it sort of feels very fuzzy. Like, okay, there's these things, they're anti-fragile, there's these emergent systems, how do you do that? How do you create that and manage the downside? And so what I thought was really interesting about this is a really concrete way. It's got some tools that allows you to actually manage those downsides. So that was a nice way that those things kind of came together for me. So the question is not related to that. It's related to the postmortem, which was, do you guys run?
Oh, yeah.
You do. So the remote postmortem situation was sort of a difficulty, and Dan talked about that. And I think this is what I was thinking about, the sort of the emotional context. You can consciously push an emotion out, right? But there's a lot of subconscious emotions that someone might not, and that you pick up on. And so how do you guys work that with entirely distributed?
Yeah, and I think, we think ChatOps really helps with putting together postmortems, because you can very easily construct the timeline, which is a huge part of it. We're mostly, in fact, a lot of the times when we do postmortems, we're more interested in sort of the timeline and how we responded mechanically to the incident and what people were thinking along the way. And those are questions that the emotional context you're not going to get from being at the table necessarily. You're not going to record it. So, I don't think ChatOps hurts there. I think it only helps because you get the timeline view. Now, we are struggling a little bit because we have recently started using Google Hangouts during incidents. And that's got pros and cons, because we get the voice rapid communication, but we also have ChatOps, and we have these two mechanisms that aren't connected. So I think there's very quickly going to be a ChatOps command that's like incident me that opens up it may be Google, it may be something else, but a recorded session so that we can record the DDoS, or the incident response. I got DDoS on the brain. record that as well as an input into the postmortem process. But it's definitely not a solved problem. Yeah.
Two related questions. What do you not yet do in ChatOps that you want to? What won't you do in ChatOps?
Let me answer. The questions were, what don't we do in ChatOps yet that we want to? And the second one is, what won't we do in ChatOps? I think what won't we do, that's interesting. I think the only thing that I would probably not do right now is anything that puts customer data at risk. So a command that puts data at risk, I'm not comfortable putting in ChatOps, just because that's kind of what it's all about, right? But I don't actually know if that's true, because we do things like database promotions, which theoretically but it doesn't put repo data at risk. And we have very recent backups, and we have slaves, so that's a different situation. I don't know what we wouldn't do, but I think that it's sort of a gut. Would this put customer data at risk? And would it put it more at risk than running it on the terminal? So I think that's kind of the litmus test, right? So I don't think there's anything we wouldn't do with ChatOps now that I think about it. And what do we want to do that we're not doing yet? We do have a thing called Hangout Me, which does ridiculous gyrations to create a hangout on the fly. I want to do some stuff like I said, the incident mode stuff. There's all kinds of interesting things we want to do. Every time we add something new, we try to ChatOps it. Yeah, James.
What's the ops team now? About 6, 8 people?
12 to 15, something like that.
Wow. Okay. Do you think this will scale?
Yeah, I think so. I do. I think it'll scale. I don't know that our team will scale in the way that it consists today at all, right? I think that we're going to end up having to specialize a little more than we do today. So I think that to the extent that we want it to scale, it'll scale just fine. So I think I actually am out of time now.